In this video, we're going to walk through replacing the steam valves on your Marzocco Linea Espresso machine. The tools that you're going to need for this are your replacement steam valve, a needle nose pliers, a regular pliers, side cut pliers, 2 adjustable wrenches, a screwdriver, a pick, and a pair of gloves. So we're going to leave the machine on to do this, but we will first need to take off the group cover here. And we'll also need to take off the cup tray. And we will also need to turn off the valve that would activate and deactivate this steam valve here. So I'm gonna put on my gloves. Sometimes when you turn this valve off, it's possible that steam will come out of the valve. So gloves will protect your hands. So just get your pliers in there and turn that valve off. And then open up the steam valve and you'll see that it's now off. So now we can start working on it. Next, we will need to remove this front piece of the steam wand knob. I already kind of loosened this, but if it's really tight, you might need to take a screwdriver and kind of hold that in there and use the screwdriver to get some leverage to loosen this, and then take it completely off. And you will see a cotter pin and a few washers in there. We're going to need to use our pliers and squeeze the flared ends of this cotter pin together and try to push it out. This can be a little difficult sometimes. Okay, now that that's out, you can unscrew the steam valve, and that's going to be counterclockwise. And set that aside. Everything on the steam valve is going to be a little bit greasy, so just have a rag or a paper towel nearby that you can wipe that off. We'll need to remove this hose right here, so we'll need to remove this zip tie. I'll take my side cuts and just snip that off. Then my needle nose pliers to just kind of pry that off. Next, you can use an adjustable wrench, or you can use a 17mm wrench to loosen this copper compression fitting on the back of the steam valve. Whenever you're removing a fitting like this, it's best to brace the fitting at another point. So I'm going to lock my adjustable wrench onto this surface of the steam valve and then take my other wrench and kind of brace against the valve to loosen that. Depending on how recently you use the machine, this might be pretty hot, so you might want to use gloves. This nut right here is the last thing that's holding the steam valve to the body of the espresso machine. So I'm going to remove that. Just be a little bit careful to stay away from the face of this panel here, just so you don't scratch a circle into it. So now you can kind of hold the steam valve up and remove that nut. You'll need to push the copper tube back a little bit to get the steam valve out. So there's our steam valve. Now we can take our new steam valve to replace the old one. And before we put the nut on the front of this valve, we're actually going to get this copper tube threaded onto the back first. Just make sure that flare fitting is seated on the back, flare fitting on the steam valve. Just be sure that the threads are going on smoothly and that you don't have to force it. So we'll just get that finger tight, and then we can get the nut on the front. And we'll tighten this with our wrench, and while we're tightening this, we have to make sure that the steam valve is positioned in the center of the hole that it's coming down through the machine. So you can just hold the bottom of the steam valve and get that centered, and then tighten this nut, and that's going to lock it in place. So as long as the steam valve moves freely back and forth, then you're good. Then we can also tighten up this copper tube flare fitting here, and just like when I took that fitting off, I'm going to brace with this wrench and then tighten it with this wrench. So we're turning it clockwise. You don't want to over tighten these fittings. You want to tighten them firmly, but don't really crank on them. And then once we turn on the steam valve there at the base of the boiler, then we can see if there's any leaks and tighten it a little bit more if necessary. We also can go ahead and stick this little hose back on here. And we're going to want to put a zip tie around this hose again, just so it doesn't slide off. And of course we can cut off that end. We'll just put a little bit of grease on the threads here. And then we can thread our knob back on here. You can just move it back and forth a few times just to spread out that grease. Then we'll take the washers that we had removed earlier. The bigger one goes on first, then the small one, and then a new cotter pin, which is included in your steam valve replacement kit. Just stick that in there with the needle nose pliers. And you're going to need to separate the legs of this pin outward so that it holds the knob and everything in place. This can be a little bit difficult. Sometimes I'll use a screwdriver and just try to push the legs apart like that, and then move the screwdriver sideways. Then you can get a needle nose pliers or regular pliers and bend them a little bit further. just as long as when you move the knob or when you thread the knob back and forth that it's gripping all those pieces and pulling that pin forward, which this one is. That's not going to go anywhere. And then once we do that, we can put this piece back on the front of the knob, and don't over tighten this because you're going to have to take it off at some point again, so just finger tight is fine. After all that's done, definitely put your gloves back on. We're going to turn this valve at the boiler back on and test out the steam valve, make sure nothing's leaking. Okay, so now I should have steam coming to my steam valve. So I'll just slowly turn that on and make sure that I do. So I'm just turning the steam valve on and off. I want to just make sure that there's no leaks at the flare fitting in the back, and make sure there's no leaks from this vacuum breaker valve on the top. Just look for drips of water coming from the steam valve. If you don't see any, then you're good, you don't have any leaks. So I don't see any leaks right now, so it looks like everything is good. We can put the cup tray back on and the panel over the group head, and you should be good to go. If you ever see water dripping from this assembly, you know that you might have a leak. It's not a big deal. You might just have to go in and tighten up the fitting. And that is how you replace a steam valve on the Marzocco Linea.